So, let's talk about parrying. And while we do this, we're going to kind of take an exploration into Fiore's text and talk about what does he have to say about parrying, what does he tell us, when to do it, how to do it. After we do that, we're going to explore of these types of parries, how do they continue to exist throughout fencing systems and authors throughout history. So, the three parries. But before we can get into it, we have to kind of outline exactly what we're talking about and then kind of do a little breakdown on how we're going to dig into things. So first off, what is a parry, right? That's kind of an important discussion point before we can start exploring how to do it. So, Fiore never actually gives us a definition. He doesn't even really use the word parry. He alludes to it, often saying things like, you guard yourself, protect yourself, but the word he generally chooses to use is more often translated as cover, as opposed to parry. Now, I'm not an Italian expert, so I don't know how accurate those translations are, but that seems to be the consistent translation throughout various different people's interpretations of what he's saying. So, we have to kind of look at other authors and create our own, and this is kind of what we're working with, right? To parry is when you are protecting yourself from your opponent's blow with your sword in a way that completely closes the opening that was being attacked, but does not allow you to threaten the opponent in the tempo in which you parried. So, this is kind of what we're using as our guidelines for defining what actions are parrying, right? It is covering, closing your opening, covering a blow, and not threatening your opponent with that action. So, moving on, let's look at how we're going to dig into these actions. So we're going to ask a couple questions as we go throughout the text. As we get to each parry, we're going to talk about how do we execute the parry, and with that execution, what guard am I transitioning into, assuming that it uses a specific guard. The second question we're going to ask is, from which guards can I execute the parry? This is very important because not everything can be done from every position, right? Everything is situational. It's based on the correct tempo and measure and positioning. So, which guard can I execute it from? And then after that, what is the follow-up action from this parry? And this is also really important for learning how to put it into your own toolbox, because a parry on its own is just going to lead to your death if that's the only thing you can do. And Fiore always gives us one, if not multiple, follow-up actions that we can do. So we're going to dig into those. And then finally, is this parry present in other sources, where, as we've done before, we'll take a look at other authors and we'll see how this technique and concept continues to evolve over the next 400 to 500 years. So, the first one we're going to talk about is the static parry. So, how do we execute the static parry? Well, first, what we have to do is we have to transition from whatever guard or position our body is in into Corona or Frontale, whichever of the names you prefer. When we do this, we're turning our true edge against our opponent's incoming blade. And ideally, we want to step forward with the foot into the blade that is coming, right? So if they cut a dritto, we are stepping forward with our left foot, and we are turning our true edge into their blow. You can see what that position looks like in the art here. This is probably the best example of the static parry that Fiore gives us. This is actually from the ball kick, but it is a perfect example of what we're trying to create. So you can see that his true edge is pointed off to his left. If they were throwing a reverso, it would be the opposite. He would rotate to the other side, and his true edge would be pointing to his right. Now, also, I added that we ideally step forward with the correct foot. Fiore is not always explicit about which foot needs to be forward, but he often shows us which one it should be. But we also know that while fencing, everything is fluid and you don't always have the tempo to get the right foot forward. So that's why this is kind of the third in line of critical pieces, because you want to have the perfect footwork, but you're not always going to be able to achieve it. So, in the previous slide, we talked that we need to transition into Frontale. So what does Fiore tell us about Frontale? Why is that the guard we're using? Well, we can look at the different quotes that he gives us to describe this guard, and it gives us a sense of how we're supposed to utilize it, right? He says, I will pardon no one, not from the edge nor the point. I don't spare each one, destroying with cuts and the point. She is a very good guard for crossing swords, and is also very good against thrusts. She is good at crossing, and she is also good against thrusts. So he's over and over again telling us this is a guard that can protect you from literally anything, right? He's very explicit about that, both cuts and thrusts. We can see here he is demonstrating what Corona should look like, right? We've got our hands at about shoulder height, and the cross guard in front of our face. From the angle, it's difficult to see exactly, because we're not looking at him straight on, where he is, but based on the information on how to use this, we can tell that you're pushing the sword to your side in order to deflect the incoming blow. He's right foot forward, so in this one, so it is possible that he's covering a reverso, right? We can see his left forearm appears to be maybe stretched across his body, so he can cover with the true edge. So, let's talk about where you can execute this this static parry from. This is important because you have to know how and when you can utilize these in order to get the most out of them. So, as we said, you need to transition from your starting guard into Corona. So, how do we do that? Well, luckily, Corona is a pretty neutral position to get to, right? Your hands are relatively high, your point is kind of forward. You can get into this guard from essentially any guard with a single tempo, right? It's a very easy middle point to move your sword into, regardless of if your sword is static, even if your sword is moving, right? Pretty much the most difficult places to get to here from are if you're in Coda Longa, right? So if your sword is on your right and pointed all the way behind you, you can still get here by either essentially doing a rising cut or from behind a descending cut. But it's going to take a little bit longer than any other guard position. And you can also, the beauty of this position is you can abandon any cut into this guard. This is a critical component of using the static parry, because you need to be aware of when you're fencing your opponent and realizing when they are taking an action that you are unprepared for, right? So Whether that is they're throwing an attack you didn't expect, or you thought you were out of measure and you're actually in measure, or you're cutting a Dritto and they suddenly cut a Reverso and surprise you. Whatever it is, you can abandon your cut simply by turning your wrist into this guard. It's very easy, it's smooth, and it's going to cover you. We often describe this as the oh shit parry, because whatever you're doing, you can immediately abandon whatever action you're doing when you're like, oh shit, this didn't work out the way I wanted, and you can go into your static parry, cover yourself, and take any of the follow-up actions and kind of reset your own sense of what's going on in the fight. So, from here, what are our follow-up actions from the static parry? Well, again, we're going to take a look at Fiore's words and see what he tells us to do. So here he says, I have made his cover, and then immediately I do what he said to do. He's referring to the master that came before him. That is, I strike first to my opponent's arms, and then I continue with a thrust into his chest. So, pretty simple instructions here, right? We are told we cover their blow, and then we're going to cut back down onto their hands. And then, if we want to, we can take a step and put the point in. Now, by comparing these two images, we can see we can get a good sense of what this action is supposed to look like, right? We look at them here. We make the static parry on our left side, and then we cut a reverso down onto their arms. Now, this play comes from the second Master of Largo, where he's basically telling us, as we discussed, the very basics of using this parry. Any questions on the static parry?
Nope, all good.
Cool. Yeah, this is kind of your basic starting position, but also a piece that you always want to keep in your toolbox because it is incredibly useful. So, let's look at other sources and talk about does the static parry survive? Right? This is one of our markers for talking about, is this technique good? Is it too specialized? Is it too unique to the weapon? Well, the answer for the static parry is Western Europe thought the static parry was incredible. And it actually becomes kind of one of the core fundamental aspects of fencing and fencing styles moving forward. Right? Especially when we get to England and the United Kingdom. Right? So some of the sources here where we can see the static parry present, we have Miller from 1737. He's writing about the Scottish broadsword. Right? Their system is highly focused around using static parries in various positions. We can see Angelo from 1817. He's writing in England, and he also is doing a military saber system, which is also using a lot of these static parries. We've got Roworth up into 1824. You can see they're using small sword here, but it's present in both the saber manuals and even some of the small sword manuals. And then all the way up to Waite in 1880, again, we can see this military saber static parry, exactly what we're seeing with the longsword, with relatively small amounts of body mechanic changes. So the answer to the question of does this survive, do people continue to using it? A resounding yes. People are very, especially Western Europe, very into the static parry.